We're going to go deeper into a story that we touched on recently, the story of what I consider to be the quintessential quote unquote sex addict in Scripture, King David. I'm fairly certain that if he was to sit down with a CSAT and do the test that's often administered to determine if he is indeed a sex addict, he would score pretty high on that scale. He had a secret sexual abasement that we're going to look at today. He had a D-Day, a day of exposure. He had consequences for the basement that he had to face. He had confession, or what clinically would be called disclosure, and he had repair work to do. So we're going to take a deeper look at this story. And some of you grew up with this story, you're familiar with it. Some of you, you've never heard it before, not in detail. About 3,000 years ago, there was a king who eventually became king of Israel named David. He's one of the most beloved figures in the Bible, right up there with Moses. He is the shepherd boy who killed the giant. Most of you are probably familiar with that story. He was a songwriter, he was a poet, he wrote most of the Psalms that we read in Scripture. Would have been a lot of those have been put into songs that people still sing today, or they'll pray in a hospital room, or they'll quote some of his writing at funerals. God himself calls David a man after his own heart. And I want you to reflect on that. When we evaluate his life, we may not give him that label. What I want you to see is that this is not a story about a monster. It's a story about a genuinely godly man, a man of integrity, a man who loved God, who loved people and loved the people that he was leading as a king. But what's also true is he had a secret sexual basement. So taking that into account, our primary story starts on a rooftop. The time of year is spring. It is the season, the scriptures say, when kings were supposed to go to war. But David was not where he was supposed to be. He wasn't on the front lines with his soldiers. He wasn't out on the battlefield. He stayed home. And he's walking around on the palace roof one evening. And as he looks down, he sees a woman. Her name is Bathsheba, and she's bathing. She's doing what the law of that time and of their culture required her to do. She was doing ritual cleansing, and she was doing it in the place that people did it, on their rooftop. The story does not indicate that she has any idea that someone is watching her. David asks one of his servants who she is. He is informed that she is the wife of Uriah. Uriah is a soldier of David's who is out risking life and limb on the front line, fighting David's war while he's back in his comfortable palace. So David knows exactly who she is, that she's married, and that she's married to one of his faithful soldiers. But he sends messengers and he takes her anyway. And the key word is takes. In ancient times, when a king would send soldiers to your door with a summons that you are to report to the king, you did not get to say, no, thank you. Scripture does not record that she consented to this at all. It does not record that she refused. She really didn't have a choice. And everyone reading this story in that day and culture understood that a woman had no option in front of her when she was faced with the absolute power of a king. That king summoned her. In those respects, this is not an affair. This is an entitled man of power who is taking what he wants from someone else. Later, after that encounter, she sends a messenger to the king with a message. 3 words: I am pregnant. And now the cover up begins. David has to cover up what he's done. So he plots a strategy to try and cover up the pregnancy first. So David brings her husband, Uriah, home from the war. He gets a break. And he tries to convince Uriah to go home to spend the night with his wife so that the pregnancy could be explained away. But Uriah is a man of integrity, and he refuses to go home and sleep in his own bed with his own wife. He says his brothers, the army, his fellow soldiers, are sleeping in tents out on a battlefield, and he will not go home and enjoy his own bed and his own wife while his brothers are out there in those conditions. So David takes his strategy to another level. He invites Uriah to his palace and he gets him drunk. And then he tries again to send Uriah home to be with his wife to cover up the pregnancy. And even Uriah, drunk, still has more integrity in this moment than David does sober. So things escalate. And isn't that the nature of our basement? It doesn't get better, it gets worse. Things escalate. So the next strategy that David comes up with is he writes a letter. And in the letter, he's ordering his general to put Uriah at the front of the hardest fighting and then pull all the other soldiers back so that Uriah is defenseless, exposed, and would certainly be killed. And David hands that letter to Uriah and sends him to carry that letter to the general himself. Uriah walks to his own death carrying his own death warrant because he's the kind of man who would never open the king's private mail. Uriah's loyalty is what got him killed. And Uriah is indeed killed in battle. And Bathsheba mourns the death of her husband. And in that culture, they had a dedicated period of time for mourning. And when that mourning time was over, David marries her. And to everyone in the kingdom watching, it looks like David is such a generous, thoughtful, kind king, taking this war widow under his wing and into his palace, and David's image is protected. He thinks the story is airtight. The husband has been buried, nobody knows. And the few servants and the general that does know, they're not going to say anything because they would suffer the same fate as Uriah. A year goes by. Bathsheba carries the child and gives birth to the child. It looks like David has gotten away with it, just like we thought we got away with our basement. For many of us, it was much longer than a year. What was David doing for that year? He was doing what he had always done. He was ruling. He was hearing cases that he needed to make judgments over. He was leading worship. He was writing music. He was being admired. What his people, his citizens, and his staff and his servants saw was a highly functioning king. By every visible measure, the cover up was working. He got away with it. Nobody knew. Uriah was now just a war statistic. And David's marriage to Bathsheba was viewed as a royal act of generosity to a soldier's widow. And the timeline was still fuzzy enough that there probably wasn't a lot of gossip. as to who was the father of this child. But then there's a turn in the story. Scripture says that God sends a man named Nathan right into the throne room. Nathan is a prophet. The word prophet in this world simply meant someone whose job was to say out loud what God was saying, whether or not the king wants to hear it. What's interesting is Nathan does not walk into the throne room and accuse King David. Instead, he tells a story. And this story hooks David in. This was the story. He tells the king, King, there were two men in your city. One was rich, with flocks that he could not even count. But the other man in your city was poor, and all he owned was one single little lamb that he raised personally. And that lamb was precious to him. That lamb would eat off of his own plate and drink from his own cup and would sleep in the arms of his owner. That lamb was like a daughter to this poor man. That's all he had. A traveler came to visit the rich man's house, and the rich man did not want to touch one of his own flock. So he stole the poor man's one lamb, and he served it to his guest for dinner. When David heard this story, he exploded. He's furious. He says, You bring that man to me right now. That man deserves to die for what he did, and he will pay back 4 times over what he stole. And Nathan says 4 words: You are the man. A year of cover up, and it falls in one moment with 4 words: D-Day. The basement is exposed. Here's what we need to understand from this story, because we men have lived this to one degree or another. Basements always demand a second story and another story and another story. Secrets are never finished because every secret creates a new exposure that needs its own cover. It never ends. David's adultery did not require murder. It was the secret that required murder. And that's the whole point. We men in this room that had basements, our basement didn't begin with the worst thing we ever did. Our basement began with something that we told ourselves that we could control, we could contain, we could create a cover for it. But then the basement issues more demands. If we get a second phone, we have to come up with a story if that phone is exposed. We have to come up with a story to hide the account. Basements always demand second stories and third stories and fourth stories. Notice what God refuses to do. David had engineered what you could call plausible deniability. He could say that he didn't kill Uriah. The enemy soldiers, the Ammonites, they're the ones that actually drew the blood. The battle was simply David's cover. But God doesn't hand any of that back to David. God says to him, No, you struck him down. You killed him. You took his wife. God's grammar, when he confronts our secrets, there's no passive voice for our engineered harm. And he doesn't accept blame shifting. Well, it was the Ammonites. It was the battle. Uriah was a casualty of war. And sometimes we have our own people that we blame as part of our cover. I wasn't trying to look for anything. It was the algorithm on social media that kept showing me clickbait. I didn't mean to do that. I had too many drinks and it lowered my guard. I didn't want to have that affair. She pursued me. God doesn't accept any of those passive voices when it comes to our basement. God attributes our infidelity to an act of our will, just like he did David. He says, no, you chose to do this. Secret has to be escalated one step at a time. In the language of Manwala, it goes from deception and manipulation of the truth to exploiting others for our own personal gain, domination and control, and a callous attitude towards the people that we harmed. In David's basement, the loudest step in the escalation is the murder, but there are a whole litany of other steps that are still significant. There's the deception that he used over the entire kingdom, his servants, his general. There's the manipulation of bringing Uriah home and trying to get him drunk and trying to make him go home and be with his wife to cover what David had did. There's the covert control of recruiting the general as a co-conspirator of his plot. And then there's the callousness of what this did to Bathsheba and the protection of his image by marrying her to make himself look like a hero and a generous, kind king. Consider the confrontation that Nathan gave to David. And let's start with what Nathan did not do. He did not walk into the throne room and say, hey, listen, I know about Bathsheba. Why did he not confront David? David has a denial for every fact. He has a counter story for every witness, and he has royal power over every consequence. When you build a system of image management, you build excuses and stories and covers to absorb any accusation that comes your way. And that's what David had done. A confrontation wouldn't have worked. So instead, Nathan tells a story. A rich man with flocks beyond counting, a poor man with one small lamb that he raised himself, that ate from his plate and drank from his cup and slept in his arms, that was like a daughter to him. A traveler arrives at the rich man's door, and the rich man, sparing his own abundant flocks, takes the poor man's one lamb and serves it for dinner. And David absolutely detonates. He burns with anger. He swears by God, and he hands down a sentence. He points at Nathan and said, that man deserves to die. He had perfect clarity for right and wrong as long as it was someone else. Totally blind to his own sin and self-deception. David's justice instincts were fully intact the whole time. His moral compass worked perfectly on everyone and everything except himself. He justified what he did. He's the signature of self-deception. And so are we. We have the capacity for moral judgment, and that capacity is not broken as long as it's aimed at everyone else, but not ourselves. David could see the sin in that rich man with total clarity the moment it was someone else's life. And that's why, in such a brilliant way, Nathan closes the trap and says, you are the man. All the rage and anger and righteous demand for justice that David felt about that rich man, all of that demand for justice is suddenly a mirror. And it forces David to look at himself. That's what D-Day is supposed to do. Before God names the crime that David had committed, he named what he provided for David. God says through the prophet, David, I anointed you. I delivered you. I rescued you. I saved you. I gave you everything you have, including your throne. And if that wasn't enough, David, I would have given you more. But what's underneath everything that David did was entitlement. David was not a deprived man who was driven to steal because he was hungry. David was a man living in luxury, drowning in abundance, who took the one lamb that belonged to a man who had almost nothing. Because somewhere along the way for David, the gifts from God did not feel like gifts anymore and started feeling like something that he was owed. The rich man in the story spared his own flock. Entitlement always spares itself, it uses other people. Now, watch what David does. This is where the story could have gone really poorly. He's still the king. Nathan is a prophet, but he's still a mortal. Kings in that world and day would execute prophets for what Nathan just said and did. And David has already shown that he has the capacity to kill to keep his basement secret. Every tool of image management is still on the table for David to use. He could deny, he could discredit the prophet, he could reframe the timeline, he could spread the blame and shift it to others, or he could perform remorse but change nothing. All of that was available for David. Instead, he says 5 words: I have sinned against God. And the basement collapsed. He didn't have excuses. He didn't have qualifiers. He didn't have explanations. He didn't provide context. He didn't mention the rooftop as if it was her fault that she shouldn't have been bathing like that. He didn't try to negotiate any of the consequences. The cover up took a year of his life. It took the life of Uriah. It broke a marriage. The confession took one moment. God did not let David's basement stand, and he didn't let yours stand either. He didn't let mine stand. He sent Nathan, the story says. Nathan was sent by God. And 3,000 years later, God still sends Nathans. No, they're not walking around wearing a prophet's robe. Your Nathan may not even be a person. Think about your story. Think about D-Day. Think about your exposure. What was your Nathan? For some of you, it was a phone bill. Your wife found it, and everything that you had built started to come apart. For some of you, it was a browser history that you thought you cleared, or a text message that you thought you deleted, but you missed that one, or a burner phone that was found in a jacket pocket, a receipt you forgot to throw away, a secret credit card that she discovered, or you were just caught in the act. Whatever it was, we all had a Nathan. It was sent by God. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't an accident. Each of us ran a sophisticated secret operation, most of us for years, if not decades. We managed devices, emails, accounts, stories, timelines. We were good at it, or we wouldn't have gotten away with it as long as we did. But inevitably, one day, it all came crashing down. David's story in the scriptures says that what he had done was displeasing to God. And then it says that God sent Nathan. God was not a spectator to David's basement, nor was he to yours. The exposure, D-Day, that felt like your life blowing up was actually God sending a Nathan, refusing to let you succeed at destroying yourself and destroying his daughter one day longer. The worst day of your old life was the first day of your real life. And you didn't arrange that. He did. Now, I know there's some of you, you weren't discovered, you came clean. That is the exception. That's not the norm. And I honor that decision to go upstairs from the basement and own what you did. Now, in sharing this story, this is delicate ground. I realize what I'm treading on right now. This teaching can be handled or interpreted poorly, and it can be misused. So I want to issue a caution here. If your basement came down because your wife found something, she found the phone bill or browser history or a receipt or a text message or a burner phone or whatever, Those items were the Nathan that God sent. Your wife was not the Nathan in your life. We are to never describe her worst day as some kind of assignment from God. She did not sign up to be your prophet. D-Day is not a nice story of God's providence in her ears. It is the day that her reality, her entire reality, was destroyed. So there are two sides and two truths to D-Day at the same time. What lands on you as God trying to break your bondages and set you free is the same day that landed on her as trauma. Both of those are true at the same time. So, men, we can thank God that we were exposed, but you don't need to be asking her to be thankful. That's not appropriate. What is appropriate is this. If your basement is still standing, and what I mean by that is if you're still sitting on secrets right now, in this moment, during this teaching, and you know you are, I want to say this as bluntly as I can. God is displeased with what you're doing, and he's going to send a Nathan. There's really only one question. Are you going to walk upstairs from the basement on your own, or are you going to wait for the knock on the door? David didn't go upstairs on his own. He didn't come clean. He got the knock from Nathan. It cost him a year of his life that he can never get back. And for many of us in this room, it cost us a lot more than a year. The Bible word for walking upstairs from your basement and owning what you've done is called confession. And what's waiting for you upstairs is two things. First is grace. God will forgive. But second is this. There are consequences for what you've done. And you need to face those consequences. God only has two plans. His plan A, his ideal plan for your life, that he says over and over again in Scripture, is humble yourself. Humble yourself. But if we don't humble ourselves, God has a plan B, and he will execute it, and it is you will be humbled. Because God is opposed to the proud. He gives a stiff arm to the proud, but he gives his grace to the humble. Nathan's parable is not only a trap for David, it's also God's description of what happened. And I want you to notice in the story where every ounce of tenderness goes. It goes to the victim. In the story, it's the lamb. That lamb that ate from his plate, who drank from his cup, who laid in his arms like a daughter. The story's entire emotional weight rests on the cherished one who had no power in the story. And the entire judgment falls on the wealthy man who took. Notice what the story never does. It doesn't charge Bathsheba. There is no verse that you can find where God or Nathan or the writer assigns her 1% of ownership. She was simply doing a ritual cleansing, a purification bath that the law required at that time, on her own roof, which is where bathing happened in that day. She was summoned by a king, and a summons from absolute power is not something that she could negotiate as if she was equal with him. But then her losses got stacked. Her husband was murdered. Her home, her child. God used a story that calls her the treasured lamb and calls what happened to her theft and slaughter. So, to the partners, the discernment that you carry about what was done to you has God's own storytelling to back you up. You may call what happened to you by its true name. It was an injustice. It was theft. It was violence against someone who didn't even have a vote. In no way are you the co-author of his basement. And if any therapist suggests that, fire them today. Let me tell you how this story actually ends, because we stopped at the confession, but the Bible doesn't. David says, I have sinned against God. And Nathan answers in the very next sentence, speaking for God, he says, God has put away your sin. He says that immediately. You will not die. There's no probation period. There's no proving yourself first. David confessed to his adultery and to his murder, and forgiveness arrived before he finished his sentence. God's grace was not slow. God's grace was waiting. The only thing that held back God's grace for a year was David's silence. But don't misunderstand, the consequences were still there, and they were severe. Both things are true at the same time. This is the math that every one of us men need to understand about the basement. When we confess, forgiveness is immediate, but repair takes years. And there are real consequences to what we did. So here's where I leave you. If your basement is down and it's exposed and you're not sitting on any secrets, thank God today for the Nathan that caused it to fall. Your posture now is one where we face the consequences of what we have done and we do repair work knowing that the repair will take years, the rest of our life. But if your basement is still standing, if you're still sitting on active secrets, you don't need me to tell you what to do. You already know. God's plan A is for you to humble yourself. Don't make him go to plan B. He will bring a Nathan into your life. It's inevitable. It will happen. And he will humble you.